Lily Harper had always believed that kindness could change the world, even if the world had never been particularly kind to her. At just 23, she worked tirelessly at Rosie's Diner, a small, run-down restaurant nestled between towering buildings in the heart of New York City. The place had seen better days, long before she was even born. The walls, once painted a cheerful pastel, were now chipped and faded. The neon open sign outside flickered uncertainly, as if debating whether to give up entirely. The booths were worn from years of weary customers leaning against them, and the hum of the ancient ceiling fan mixed with the sizzling of the griddle behind the counter. Despite its flaws, Rosie's was home to Lily. It was the place where she had learned to balance a tray with one hand and pour coffee with the other. It was where she greeted regulars by name, where she memorized how old Mr. Peterson liked his eggs and exactly how much cream Mrs. Alvarez needed in her morning coffee. And it was where she worked every day from the crack of dawn to well past midnight, smiling through exhaustion. Her smile was something of a legend at Rosie's. Not the forced, tired kind that most people wore out of obligation, but a genuine warmth that made people feel seen. No matter how difficult the day had been, no matter how many rude customers or difficult orders she had to deal with, Lily never let it break her spirit. Maybe it was because she knew what it was like to feel invisible. She didn't have the luxury of dreams, not really. Dreaming was for people who had the time to chase them. For Lily, life was about survival, paying rent on time, keeping the electricity from being shut off, and making sure her younger brother, Ethan, had everything he needed for school. Every dollar she earned was carefully counted, divided between food, bills, and whatever was left over for emergencies. But even in the midst of her struggles, Lily found time for one small act of kindness that set her apart from most. Every night, after she clocked out her shift, she gathered leftover food from the diner. A half-eaten loaf of bread that was still good, a bowl of soup that hadn't been served, biscuits that were slightly overbaked but perfectly edible. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she walked home through the dimly lit streets, she made sure to stop where she knew they would be. The men and women curled under thin blankets, huddled in doorways, seeking shelter from a cold. She never asked for names or backstories. She didn't need to. A simple "here, this should help," followed by a quiet "stay warm," was enough. The grateful smiles, the whispered thank yous, the quiet sighs of relief as someone wrapped their hand around a warm meal. Those are the reasons she did it. To her, it was just a small act of kindness. To those she helped, it meant the world. The rain had started as a soft drizzle, tapping lightly against the pavement, but by the time Lily Harper stepped out of Rosie's Diner, it had transformed into a relentless downpour. The streets of New York shimmered under the glow of street lights, the reflections broken by ripples in the endless puddles. She pulled her worn jacket tighter around her, though it did little to keep the cold from seeping in. The thin fabric, damp from the moisture in the air, clung to her skin as she quickened her pace. It was late, and she was exhausted, but she had walked home in worse conditions before. She had barely made it 2 blocks when something caught her eye, a small, unmoving figure curled up on a bench under a bus stop shelter. The dim, flickering light overhead cast long shadows, making it difficult to see at first, but as she drew closer, her stomach twisted. It was a child. He was no older than 8. His tiny frame hunched over, arms wrapped around his knees as though trying to disappear into himself. His clothes were soaked through, his dark hair plastered against his forehead, and he shivered violently, his thin body unable to fight off the bitter cold. He wasn't crying, but there was something in the way he sat, so still, so quiet, that made her heart ache. She knelt beside him, ignoring the way the rain soaked into her jeans. "Hey there," she said softly, keeping her voice gentle so she wouldn't startle him. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't answer right away. He hesitated, then lifted his head just enough for her to see his face. His cheeks were pale, lips trembling, and his wide brown eyes held something deeper than just fear, hopelessness. "Where are your parents?" she asked, though deep down, she already knew what his answer would be. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than the rain, he whispered, "I don't have anyone." Lily felt her throat tighten. She had seen plenty of homeless people on these streets before, but never someone so young. It wasn't right. No child should be sitting alone in the freezing rain with nowhere to go, no one to look after them. Her hands instinctively reached for the bag she carried, where she had a few sandwiches left over from the diner. But as she pulled one out and offered it to him, he hesitated. "I'm hungry," he admitted, his voice small. That was all she needed to hear. Lily stood up and held out her hand. "Come with me," she said, not giving him a chance to refuse. For a second, the boy looked up at her, as if trying to decide whether he could trust her. Then, slowly, his ice-cold fingers wrapped around hers, small and fragile against her calloused palm. She didn't care that the rain was coming down harder now, that both of them were getting soaked with every step they took. The diner wasn't far, and she knew there was warmth, food, and safety waiting for him there. That was all that mattered. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open, leading the boy inside. The warmth of the diner hit them instantly, the scent of coffee and grilled food filling the air. The few late-night customers barely spared them a glance as she hurried him to a booth. "Stay here," she told him as she grabbed one of the spare blankets they kept in the back. She draped it around his tiny shoulders before rushing behind the counter. Within minutes, she had a steaming bowl of soup in front of him, the rich aroma of chicken broth and vegetables rising in the air. The boy hesitated only for a moment before picking up the spoon. The second the first sip passed his lips, something changed in his face. The tightness in his features eased, his body relaxed just slightly, and then he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was the first glimpse of light she had seen in his expression since she found him. And in that moment, Lily didn't feel the cold anymore. The rain drummed steadily against the windshield of a sleek black car idling across the street from Rosie's diner. Inside, James Dalton sat in the driver's seat, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other pressed against his temple as he let out a slow breath. The weight of the day clung to him. Another endless string of board meetings, contract negotiations, and phone calls that drained every last ounce of his patience. He had needed to clear his head, to escape the suffocating luxury of his penthouse. And so he had driven aimlessly through the quieter streets of the city, searching for he didn't even know what. And then he saw her. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting curiosity. A young woman, kneeling on the rain-soaked pavement, her hands gently reaching out to a small, shivering figure under the bus stop shelter. 1,000 people must have passed by that boy, each one turning a blind eye, too caught up in their own lives to notice him. But she had noticed. James adjusted in his seat, watching as she leaned in, speaking softly. Though he couldn't hear her words, the tenderness in her posture told him everything. A moment later, she held out her hand, and the boy, hesitant at first, placed his small fingers in hers. No hesitation on her part, no reluctance, just quiet, unwavering kindness. Something deep in James's chest tightened. He had spent years surrounded by people who only cared about themselves. Business partners who spoke in numbers, not emotions. Acquaintances who valued power over principle. He himself had learned to detach, to view the world through a lens of strategy and profit. It had been a necessity, one that had made him wealthy beyond imagination. And yet, as he sat there watching this stranger lead a homeless child through the rain, something inside him stirred. He told himself to drive away. This wasn't his business. He had deadlines to meet, calls to return, deals to close. And yet, his fingers lingered over the gear shift, his gaze locked onto the small diner's entrance as the door swung open and the woman ushered the boy inside. James leaned forward slightly, catching a glimpse through the window. She moved quickly, draping a blanket around the child's shoulders before disappearing behind the counter. Moments later, she returned with a steaming bowl of soup, setting it in front of him with the same warmth and care as a mother tending to her own child. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't performative kindness meant to be witnessed and praised. This was genuine. A memory flickered at the edges of James's mind, unbidden and unwanted. The face of his mother, back when life had been simpler. Before the wealth, before the cutthroat deals. before he had learned that trust was a currency too expensive to afford. She had been like that too. The kind of person who helped others simply because it was the right thing to do. For the first time in years, James felt something he couldn't quite name. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a small notepad. His pen hovered over the blank paper for a moment before he scribbled down the words, Rosie's Diner. A second longer, a final glance at the woman inside, still smiling despite the exhaustion that was evident in the way she carried herself. Then, with a quiet exhale, he put the car in drive and pulled away. But the image of her, drenched in rain, hands wrapped gently around a child in need, followed him long after he was gone. James Dalton had built his life around logic and precision. His world was one of numbers, contracts, and acquisitions, where emotions were nothing more than distractions and sentimentality had no place. Yet, no matter how many reports he read or meetings he attended, he couldn't shake the image of the woman in the rain. Days had passed since that night, but she remained fixed in his mind, her unwavering kindness, the way she had shielded the boy from the cold without hesitation, the warmth in her touch when she took his hand. He had witnessed grand gestures before. Business moguls writing checks to charities for the sake of publicity. Wealthy elites attending galas that claimed to change lives, but rarely did. This had been different. There was no audience, no expectation of reward. It had been pure. He found himself wondering about her more than he should have. Who was she? What was her story? Did she help others like that every day? And why? When she clearly had so little, did she still choose to give? One evening, after another day of drowning in corporate decisions that suddenly felt unbearably trivial, James made a choice. He was going to find her. The neon open sign flickered as he pulled up outside Rosie's Diner. From the moment he stepped inside, he knew he didn't belong. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and expensive watch fell out of place among the scuffed floors and worn-out booths. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the quiet hum of conversation and the clinking of plates. The bell above the door chimed, drawing Lily's attention. She was balancing a tray of plates, her movements practiced, fluid, a dance learned through years of repetition. Stray wisps of hair had escaped from the loose bun at the nape of her neck, and there was a faint crease of exhaustion between her brows. But none of that dulled the warmth in her expression when she turned to greet him. "Welcome to Rosie's. Have a seat anywhere you like," she said, flashing the same kind smile she had given the boy in the rain. James hesitated, caught off guard. He had prepared himself for a cold, detached exchange, for the possibility that the moment he had witnessed had been a single act of kindness rather than a reflection of who she truly was. But now, standing in front of her, he knew this was who she was. He chose a booth in the corner, settling in as he watched her work. Lily moved through the diner like someone who had been doing this her whole life. She knew her customers, not just their orders, but their lives. He saw the way she leaned down to help an elderly man count his change, patiently placing the correct bills in his wrinkled hands. The way she set down a free refill of coffee in front of a young mother struggling to quiet her fussy baby. The way she paused beside a regular who seemed unusually quiet, her voice soft as she asked if he was okay. She didn't just serve food, she cared. And James, who had spent his life surrounded by people who only looked out for themselves, couldn't look away. When Lily finally reached his table, notepad in hand, he barely heard her ask what he wanted to order. For the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. He ordered without thinking, his voice almost distant as he handed her the menu. And as she walked away, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, an ache he couldn't explain. By the time he finished his meal, he knew he had to do something. Lily returned with the bill, her expression still bright despite the clear signs of exhaustion lingering in her eyes. James took the receipt without a word, reaching into his wallet. But instead of simply paying, he pulled out an envelope, one he had prepared before coming here. He slipped it beneath the plate, adjusting it so she wouldn't see it right away. He didn't say anything as he stood up, didn't linger or wait for her notice. Instead, he walked out of Rosie's, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. It wasn't until Lily returned to clear the table that she saw it. At first, she thought it was just a normal tip, maybe a little more than usual, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then she picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it, and something inside her chest tightened. Her fingers trembled as she slid it open. Inside, a stack of crisp bills stared back at her, far more than any customer had ever left before. Lily's breath hitched. This wasn't just a generous tip. It was life-changing. Her gaze darted toward the door, heart pounding, as she rushed outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shimmering beneath the glow of streetlights. She turned frantically, scanning the sidewalk, searching for him. But the black car that had been parked outside was already gone. The next day started like any other. Lily tied on her apron, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and braced herself for another long shift at Rosie's Diner. The familiar morning rush had already begun. Regulars settled into their usual booths, steaming cups of coffee in hand, while hurried businessmen placed to-go orders before dashing off to work. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the rhythmic sizzle of bacon on the griddle. It was a routine she had lived for years, one that offered little surprise. Until he walked in. The bell above the door chimed, and Lily glanced up from the coffee pot she was refilling. A man stood just beyond the entrance, his tailored suit and polished shoes in immediate contrast to the cozy, worn-down atmosphere of Rosie's. He didn't belong here, not really, but there was something in the way he scanned the room, searching for something or someone that made Lily pause. Then his eyes landed on her. A strange tug of familiarity pulled at the back of her mind, though she couldn't quite place him. She didn't have time to linger on the thought. The hostess approached her, a note of curiosity in her voice. "That gentleman over there asked for you to be his server." Lily frowned slightly. It wasn't often that customers requested her specifically, but she simply shrugged it off and approached his table, notepad in hand, her usual polite smile in place. "Good afternoon," she greeted him, the same warmth in her voice she gave to every customer. "What can I get you today?" The man hesitated just for a second before responding. "I'll take the special," he said, his tone even, almost too calm. Then, with an easy smile, he added, "But only if you promise to take a break and have coffee with me later." Lily blinked, caught off guard by the request. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head lightly. "I don't usually take breaks during my shift." The man chuckled, as if he had expected that answer. "Then just the special for now." He handed her the menu without another word. As she walked away, a strange feeling settled in her chest. There was something about him, something in the way he looked at her, like he knew her from somewhere. Like he was studying her, waiting for something. But she brushed it off and focused on getting through the lunch rush. Still, as the meal progressed, she couldn't help but notice how his gaze followed her. Not in the way some men stared too long, making her uncomfortable. No, this was different. Observant, curious, almost admiring. She did her best to ignore it, going about her work as usual. She refilled coffee cups, laughed softly at an old man's joke, helped a mother juggle her toddler and her plate. She didn't need to think about what she was doing. It was second nature by now. But every time she glanced toward his booth, he was watching. By the time she returned with his check, she was starting to feel unsettled. He reached for his wallet, but before she could step away, his voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. Lily paused, looking at him with mild confusion. "Yes." The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Do you remember helping a homeless boy on the street last week?" Her breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the bill in her hands as her mind raced. "How did he know about that?" "Yes," she said cautiously. "How do you?" But he was already reaching into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He held out to her, his expression unreadable. "This is for you," he said simply. "Open it after I leave." Lily hesitated, but something in his voice, something almost solemn, made her take the paper. She watched as he stood, smoothing out his suit. For a second, she thought he might say something else, explain himself, but he only gave her a final lingering look before turning and walking toward the door. The bell jingled as it swung shut behind him. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the folded paper in her hands. The noise of the diner faded into the background as curiosity gnawed at her. Heart pounding, she carefully unfolded the note. At first, all she saw was a number. Her breath hitched as the reality of it sank in. $50,000. Her hands trembled as she reread it, convinced she must have misunderstood, but the number remained the same. Beneath it, written in elegant handwriting, was a simple message. Your kindness has inspired me. Use this to create the future you deserve. A grateful stranger. Lily's heart raced as she bolted toward the door, scanning the street for any sign of him, for the black car she now remembered seeing before. But he was gone. The rain had started again, light and misty, dusting the pavement in silver. The city moved on around her, cars honking, people passing by, life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But for Lily, everything had changed. The check changed everything. At first, Lily had been convinced there had to be some mistake. $50,000? It was an amount so far beyond anything she had ever possessed that she struggled to even comprehend what it could mean for her. She had stood there in the middle of the diner, her hands trembling, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Who was he? Why had he done this? And most of all, what was she supposed to do now? Returning the money had crossed her mind more times than she could count. But how? He had left no contact information, no way for her to find him. The only thing she had was that note. Use this to create the future you deserve. And so, for the first time in her life, Lily let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more. She paid off the debts that had weighed her down for years, ensuring that her younger brother, Ethan, would never have to worry about tuition or overdue bills again. She finally replaced the leaky faucet in her apartment, bought a winter coat that actually kept her warm, and let herself take a deep breath without the ever-present anxiety of wondering how she was going to make it to the next paycheck. But she didn't stop there. The dream she had always tucked away, too afraid to chase, now stood before her like an open door. She had worked in diners her whole life, serving coffee with a smile, memorizing orders, and making customers feel at home. She had always imagined owning a place of her own. A small cafe, somewhere warm and welcoming, where no one would ever be turned away because they couldn't afford a meal. Now, for the first time, that dream was possible. She spent every free moment sketching ideas in an old notebook, researching rental spaces, calculating costs. She still didn't know exactly how she would pull it off, but the seed had been planted, and with every step forward, she thought of the stranger who had given her this chance. She still wondered about him, the man in the tailored suit with the kind, knowing smile. And then, one evening, she got her answer. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting a golden glow on the damp pavement as she walked home from another long shift. The city hummed around her, but for a moment, she let herself drift into thought, dreaming about the cafe she would open one day. That was when the black car pulled up beside her. Lily slowed to a stop, her heart skipping a beat as the tinted window rolled down. And there he was, the stranger. Only now, he wasn't just a shadow from a fleeting moment. He was real, standing before her in the dim light, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I hoped I'd find you," he said. Lily stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "You again," she breathed. "Why did you do it? Who are you?" He hesitated, then took a step closer, his voice softer this time. "I owe you an explanation." She watched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He held out to her, and when she took it, her eyes widened to the name embossed in gold lettering. Andrew Hale, CEO of Hale Enterprises. The weight of it hit her all at once. Andrew Hale wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a name she had heard in passing on the news and magazines. He owned industries, led corporations, controlled more money than she could ever fathom. And yet, here he was, standing on a quiet street corner, looking at her as though she were the one who had changed his life. She shook her head in disbelief. I didn't tell you who I was," he interrupted gently, "because I wanted to see how you'd react. I wanted to know if what I saw that night was who you really are." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady. I've spent years building wealth, closing deals, making more money than I could ever spend. But that night, I saw something that money could never buy. Lily swallowed hard, unable to look away. I saw someone who had nothing to gain but still chose to give. He continued. You didn't hesitate to help that boy. You didn't walk past him like so many others would have. And that. His lips curved into a soft, almost wistful smile. That is the kind of person who deserves the world. Lily didn't know what to say. She had spent her whole life being invisible, struggling, surviving. And now, one of the most powerful men in the city was standing in front of her, telling her that she had inspired him. I don't understand, she murmured. You already gave me more than I could ever ask for. Andrew's smile deepened. Not yet. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her an envelope. Lily hesitated before taking it, her fingers shaking as she slid it open. And then, her breath caught. Inside was a deed. She stared at the paper, uncomprehending. What is this? A cafe, Andrew said simply. Downtown. It's yours now. Her head snapped up. No, she said immediately, shaking her head. This is too much. I can't. Yes, you can, he said firmly. Consider it an investment. Not in a business, but in a person. In you. Tears burned at the back of Lily's eyes. She had spent so long giving, never expecting anything in return. And now, here he was, offering her everything she had ever dreamed of, because he believed in her. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Andrew's expression softened. Just promise me one thing. Lily met his gaze. Anything. Keeping the person who inspired me. She let out a shaky breath, a tear slipping down her cheek. I will. And from that moment on, everything changed. Her cafe became more than just a place to serve coffee. It became a haven for the struggling mother, for the man counting his last few dollars, for the children who needed warmth. No one was ever turned away, because kindness, she had learned, had the power to change the world. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it has the power to change your own. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as the first rays of morning light streamed through the wide glass windows of Harper's Haven. A name Lily had carefully chosen, not just for herself, but for what she wanted this place to represent. The cafe was small but inviting, with warm wooden tables, soft lighting, and walls lined with bookshelves where anyone could sit and lose themselves in a story. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon lingered, wrapping around customers like a gentle embrace, and the steady hum of conversation mixed with the quiet clinking of cups against saucers. But this was not just any cafe. A sign near the entrance read, "If you need a meal and can't afford one, it's on the house." It had been months since Andrew Hale had handed her the deed, changing her life with nothing more than a quiet act of faith. And yet, every day, she still woke up half expecting it to have all been a dream. That somehow, she would walk through those doors and find herself back at Rosie's, balancing trays and counting coins just to make it through the month. But no, this was real. And more than that, it was hers. The first few weeks had been overwhelming. Signing paperwork, picking out furniture, training staff, it had all felt surreal. But through it all, Lily had held on to one promise. This cafe would never just be another business. It would be a place where people felt seen. The homeless man who had been sleeping in the alleyway just 2 blocks down, he now came in every morning for a hot meal, no questions asked. The single mother who used to ration her coffee budget just to afford daycare, she had a warm seat and a free refill waiting for her. The teenager who had been living out of a backpack, searching for a safe place to sit for a few hours without being judged, he had found that seat here. Lily didn't ask for their stories. She didn't need to. She had been there once, tired, struggling, wondering if anyone in the world truly noticed her. Now, she was the one noticing them. And every once in a while, when the cafe was quiet and she stood behind the counter watching it all unfold, she would wonder about Andrew. He had disappeared from her life just as quickly as he had entered it. No calls, no emails, no check-ins. Just a man who had seen something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself, and had decided to change her life because of it. She still didn't fully understand why fate had brought him to that street on that rainy night. But maybe she didn't need to, Because as she watched a little girl laughing over a cup of hot chocolate, as she refilled the coffee of an old man who had nowhere else to be, as she saw the relief in the eyes of a young woman who had just received a meal she didn't have to pay for, she knew this was always meant to be. One small act of kindness had rippled outwards, touching lives she hadn't even met yet. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of it. Kindness never goes unnoticed. Sometimes, fate has a way of rewarding those who give without expecting anything in return. And sometimes, a single moment of compassion can change everything, not just for one person, but for the world around them. Conclusion and life lessons from Lily's story. Lily's journey is a testament to the power of kindness. How even the smallest act can create ripples that change lives in ways we never expect. She didn't help that homeless boy for recognition or reward. She didn't know anyone was watching. She simply did what was right. And in return, fate brought someone into her life who saw her heart and gave her the chance she never would have asked for. Through her cafe, she continued to spread that same kindness, proving that when you give without expecting anything in return, the universe often finds a way to give back to you in ways you never imagined. But perhaps the most powerful lesson here is that we all have the ability to make a difference. You don't need to be a billionaire to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is a warm meal, a kind word, or simply noticing someone who feels invisible. Compassion costs nothing, but its impact is priceless. And now I want to ask you, what small act of kindness can you do today? Maybe it's smiling at a stranger. Maybe it's helping someone in need. Or maybe it's as simple as sharing this story so more people can be reminded of the power of generosity. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because in the end, kindness is what truly changes the world. And together, we can make it a better place, one small act at a time. Yellow Heart.